Hello, thank you. Oh, that's loud. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to this evening's 2025 Prothero Lecture, hosted, as ever, by the Royal Historical Society. Hi, come in, it's fine. So my name's Lucy Noakes. I'm the president of the Society, and it's my really, honestly, very, very great pleasure to welcome you all this evening, both those here in the venue, not as hot as it could have been, which is a relief to all of us, I'm sure, and those joining us online. So the Prothero Lecture is one of the highlights of the Society's annual events calendar. Established in 1968, the lecture, which is named for the historian and former RHS president, George W. Prothero, has been given annually since that date. And those invited to give the lecture are leading historians whose research has shaped fundamentally how we think about the past. Prothero lecturers over the past 5 decades include, among many others, Joanna Book, Linda Colley, Stefan Collini, Natalie Zemon Davis, Olwyn Houghton, Quentin Skinner, and Keith Thomas. And many lectures have been opportunities for leading scholars to reflect on their work and careers in the round. And this evening is no exception. To give the 2025 Prothero Lecture, I am delighted to welcome Peter Gatrell, Emeritus Professor of History at Manchester, whose work and contribution to scholarship will be well known, I'm sure, to many of you. And Peter, just a quick bio of Peter. Peter was appointed to the University of Manchester in 1976. Sorry, I was doing so well. From where he retired in 2021 after a career teaching Russian economic and social history, the cultural history of modern war, and refugee history. And Peter has, of course, published books and articles on all these topics. These include a celebrated trilogy on refugee history, A Whole Empire Walking, Refugees in Russia during World War I, first published in 1999, Free World, the campaign to save the world's refugees in 2011, and The Making of the Modern Refugee in 2013. More recent works include the excellent The Unsettling of Europe, The Great Migration, 1945 to the present, which provides us with a new history of a highly mobile and fluid continent seen through the lens of migration, published by Penguin in 2019, has pride of place on my bookcase. And Peter's latest co-authored book is Refugee Voices in Modern Global History, Reckoning with Refugeedom, which just came out this April. As one outcome from a major research project, Refugee Voices makes extensive and innovative use of the thousands of individual case files held by the UNHCR, the UN Office for Refugees, in Geneva. And in recognition of this work, perhaps unsurprisingly, Peter has received many awards. These include his election to the Fellowship of the Academy of Social Sciences and to the British Academy, and of course, Peter is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. And for this evening's lecture, Peter is going to draw on his latest research on refugee voices and experiences as reflected in the UNHCR archive. And it's in this archive that self-representation of displaced people intersects with the responses, positive or otherwise, of refugee-creating and refugee-hosting states. It's very timely. As Peter will argue, to explore these intersections between what's been the fourth world of refugees and nation-states offers new ways to write the global history of human displacement and mobility, as I'm sure that you'll all agree, this is a much-needed history. So please now join me in welcoming Peter Gatrell to give the 2025 RHS Prothero Lecture on the subject of Refugee Worlds, a 20th-Century Retrospective. Peter.
Well, President, Vice President, thank you so much for those warm words of introduction. I'd also like to take this opportunity of thanking the past president, Emma Griffin, who first invited me, and of course members of council, not forgetting the office team that has made all this possible. So thanks to Philip Lisa and Sibika. I should also perhaps begin by thanking other scholars, because I'm not going to name check many people in today's talk, but I think you'll understand that the kind of enterprise that I've been involved in is only possible because of the work of a large number of other scholars and indeed institutions who I hope to have the opportunity of thanking in the published version of this lecture, assuming it's accepted by the transactions of the Royal Historical Society. And of course this includes a large body of work on pre-20th century refugees and refugee history, which I shan't be drawing upon today, but I'm happy to engage, if anyone wants to, with issues arising in the early modern and 19th century period. Okay, so let me begin not in the 20th century, but in the 21st. And browsing, as I sometimes do in a bookshop in Bath, I came across a book by A.A. Gill, a collection of the articles that Gill, the journalist, assembled, or rather his publisher did after he died. And you can read for yourself what he says in this article. A man comes over and asks me to come with him. He's worried about his friend who's threatened to kill himself. I collect a UNHCR worker and we're led to a young chap I recognise. I saw him the day before in tears. I buy him an orange juice and ask me to tell his story. So this was a brief visit that Gill made to the Greek island of Kos in 2015 to see for himself the situation of refugees who had arrived in large numbers during what became known as the Mediterranean refugee crisis. Buying him an orange juice enabled Gill to file his copy and return to London. But in quoting this brief extract, I admit to being a bit unfair on Gill, who pointedly contrasted the arrival of refugees in Greece with British holidaymakers who were in close proximity but largely oblivious to their presence. Gill also explained that refugees were often unfairly described as, quote, economic migrants. He mentioned the persecution that drove this 22-year-old gay man to leave Iraq. But Gill's remarks have stuck in my mind as an illustration of the ethical issues involved in soliciting an individual's testimony, even when the intention to dramatize the human costs of displacement is well meant. And I'll have more to say shortly about other such reportage from a different era and the implications of such encounters. Now, I referred in the lecture outline to a speech given by Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan, the High Commissioner of UNHCR, the UN Office for Refugees, in 1973, and he spoke to the UN General Assembly and declared the facts point to the existence of what is virtually a fourth world, a world without representation in this or any other assembly, yet peopled by millions, refugees, the displaced and often stateless, and others in similar circumstances. Now, Sadruddin, who was a remarkably young appointment to UNHCR, only in his 30s when he took up office, his appointment represented a break with tradition, given that his three predecessors had all been European diplomats. And in 1977, towards the end of his tenure, Sadruddin challenged UNHCR to acknowledge that, quote, it was, and to a great extent still is, a Western European club. Sadruddin himself came from an immensely privileged background, Ismaili Muslim royalty, Harvard educated, he shared a room with Edward Kennedy and corresponded with Kennedy, supremely well connected, and with a mansion on the shores of Lake Geneva filled with a priceless collection of Islamic art. If there were four worlds, Sadruddin certainly belonged to the first. There are intriguing questions to ask about his career, his wish to see UNHCR recruit more non-Europeans, which set the cat amongst the pigeons in Geneva, where UNHCR maintained its headquarters. But I want to reflect instead on the implications of a refugee world in modern history and how and by whom that history is written. One example came in the form of an official history that UNHCR published in 2000 to coincide with its 50th anniversary. And it focused mainly on the late 20th century and on UNHCR's response to events in Southeast Asia, particularly Cambodia, East Central Africa, especially Rwanda, the former Soviet Union, and former Yugoslavia. It adopted the institutional language of refugee crisis, challenges, and durable solutions. It highlighted the role of successive high commissioners whose portraits were neatly juxtaposed alongside photographs of bedraggled men, women, and children, such as that of Rwandan refugees entering Tanzania in 1994. But this account included no testimony from refugees who figure as an anonymous mass. I don't want to be overly critical of this institutional history. We learn something of UNHCR's diplomacy and what's come to be called the International Refugee Regime, with the 1951 United Nations Refugee Convention as a cornerstone of international refugee law. Nor is this the right time to dwell on the shortcomings of a history, because UNHCR is, along with other UN bodies, experiencing a period of unprecedented turbulence. Nevertheless, as I hope to show, a different kind of history is possible. So what does Sadruddin mean when he spoke of a fourth world? Evidently, he identified a target group that UNHCR had a mandate to protect from persecution. But many refugees fell outside this mandate, either because they were supported by other UN agencies, such as Palestinian refugees, or because they hadn't crossed an international frontier and were instead internally displaced, or because they were deemed not to have lost their nationality and were therefore the responsibility of a given state, as in the case of millions of ethnic Germans expelled from Central Europe in the wake of the Second World War, and millions of refugees displaced by the partition of India. UNHCR's mandate was thus selective and exclusionary. Nor did Sadruddin dwell on the origins of this fourth world, although he would certainly have known of UNHCR's predecessor organizations, notably the first International Office for Refugees, established by the League of Nations in 1921 and headed by Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen, with a responsibility for protecting specific groups of refugees, namely Russians who had fled from Bolshevik rule and Armenians who had survived the genocide at the hands of Young Turks, making it possible for them to obtain travel papers in the shape of the famous Nansen passport. Half a century later, UNHCR already had 2 decades of working on behalf of European refugees of pre-war vintage, such as Spanish Republican refugees, later on, those who had been compelled to work for the Nazi regime as forced laborers until its defeat, and who were unwilling, at the end of the war, to return, many of them, to their countries in Eastern Europe. UNHCR also assumed responsibility for refugees who fled the communist takeover of their countries after the war, and in 1956 it coordinated efforts on behalf of Hungarian refugees. From a Western Eurocentric point of view, the fourth world owed its existence to the second. But in speaking of a fourth world, Sadruddin had in mind a population that belonged to a distinct realm of being, distinct in that refugees were sometimes, but not always, stateless and required international protection. Understandably, as I said, he referred to refugees who came within the mandate of UNHCR. He made no direct reference to the fact that refugees were regularly, but not always, confined to camps. Nor did he mention the diversity of this refugee world along lines of age and gender, for example. But significantly, he spoke of people without representation, excluded from the political realm. Sadruddin was certainly familiar with the situation in sub-Saharan Africa, and in 1973, he wished it to be known, quote, "I cannot speak of the situation in Africa without pointing out that the overwhelming majority of refugees of concern to my office came from territories under colonial administration. I'll return to these points later. But in my view, Sadruddin's argument said more about UNHCR than it did about refugees. However much he wished to publicise their plight, he trod a well-worn path in regarding refugees as a category of people to be observed rather than to be thought of as observers in their own right. As it happens, some 10 years prior to Sadruddin's speech, the British journalist and broadcaster Robert Key had articulated something similar when he wrote of Refugee World. This was the title he gave to a book in which he recounted his visits to refugee camps in Germany and Austria in 1960. Here we have young Robert Key as a prisoner of war in Germany during the Second World War. Robert Key as part of the so-called Famous Five who launched TVAM in 1983. But curiously, the book cover, Refugee World, is not of refugees in Germany or Austria. It's a photograph of a young Algerian refugee in Tunisia, captured for photographic purposes in February 1960. But these camps he visited in connection with a UN campaign for World Refugee Year, which took place in 1959 to 1960. And the campaign for World Refugee Year was designed to publicise not just the plight of now often elderly European refugees, but also Palestinian refugees, elderly Russians in China still, who'd been there since more or less 1917, and Chinese refugees in Hong Kong. But it wasn't these refugees with which Key was concerned. He was mainly concerned with those in camps in Europe, then known dismissively or disparagingly as the hardcore. People who languished in camps for 15 years, usually connected to long-term illness or disability that wrecked their hopes of resettlement. And Key wanted to engage with the human costs of displacement by engaging with refugees face-to-face. And he soon learned that UNHCR officials acted as gatekeepers and that he needed to enlist their help. Perhaps because he was sceptical about the achievements of World Refugee Year, Key's book garnered little attention. A somewhat bigger splash came in the form of a short Penguin paperback book, Refugees 1960, a report in words and drawings, which had appeared a few months earlier. It was illustrated by Ronald Searle, already a well-known cartoonist and illustrator, and with text by Kay Webb, his then wife, who had begun to make a name for herself in magazine journalism, including Picture Post, and who would shortly become the driving force behind Puffin Books. The UN Public Relations Office invited them in 1959 to tour refugee camps in Europe in the hope, quote, that first-hand reporting might stir pity, open pocketbooks, and even relax restrictions more effectively than speeches or statistics. Unlike Robert Key, they travelled to Greece and Italy as well as Austria, although not to West Germany. Of these two contemporary histories, it's Refugee World that ultimately commands the attention of scholars. I say this because Robert Key managed to pull off the important trick of telling his readers that alongside the situation of individual refugees trapped in camps or overcrowded tenements, it was important to take account of those who had power over them. In doing so, he made it clear that he despised the impersonal bureaucratic language of caseload and programs for dealing with, quote, the refugee problem. He didn't hold back in criticising most of the UNHCR personnel he met, but who smoothed his path. One encounter was particularly revealing. A 37-year-old official by the name of Raymond Thérion, at the time based in Bonn, told Key, quote, I've been seeing refugees ever since 1945, when I went into Austria with the military government. He asserted that, quote, refugees know where they are. This camp is their security. They have their camp administration, their little parcels of cheese. They don't want to get out into the rough world. To underline his claim to extensive knowledge, Thérion offered Key a favour. As I was going out, he asked his secretary to look out a file for me. Have a glance through it if you have time. You'll see the sort of thing I mean. It's just one of thousands. And his secretary handed me the story of Dusan Dokic. Inside, a sheet of paper gave a few humdrum particulars of Mr. Dokic's life. Like Webb and Searle, he chose to name refugees, although likewise he didn't seek their permission. As a journalist, Key doubtless enjoyed this sneak preview, though he reported this parting shot less as a sign of generosity than as an indication of this official's lofty approach to his caseload. Key himself acknowledged the gulf in understanding between officialdom and refugees and was sufficiently self-critical to recognize what we would now call his positionality. Quote, "To have been a refugee over a long period of years is to have built up an inner world of feeling and experience of which the outsider can often have little idea." Perhaps the words outsider and often were an oblique reference to Key's own incarceration as a prisoner of war, as indeed was Ronald Searle, that underlined, in his words, the remorseless indifference to the fate of the individual human being. Be that as it may, the official's cavalier readiness to share a personal case and Key's decision to identify the person in question gave me a sharp jolt, as I shall explain. I was particularly struck by Key's remark that, in his words, a lot went on in the refugee world that never got near the High Commissioner or anyone else in their neatly roneoed and precisely worded files. Struck because of his insight that the refugee world defied easy bureaucratic compartmentalization, but also because I have spent many months reading those files for myself. Indeed, there's far more to these files than Key imagined. Between 1951 and 75, which is when this extraordinary collection comes to an end, thousands of refugees contacted Geneva or UNHCR's branch offices in Europe, the Middle East, East Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Australia. UNHCR collated and archived these letters for its legal bureaucratic purpose, namely to establish precedent in deciding who and who was not eligible for protection and assistance in accordance with its mandate and the Refugee Convention. And UNHCR inherited from the International Refugee Organization, a predecessor organization, and maintained and updated what it called the Eligibility Manual, which is a series of kind of case studies designed to inform official decision-making. So this is an extraordinarily rich resource, enabling the historian to see things through refugees' eyes, since they wrote, sometimes at considerable length, about their predicament. Many of them wrote because they understood the need to couch their requests in terms of what they knew of the refugee regime, hence providing chapter and verse about the persecution they had suffered and at whose hands. The files include numerous templates, such as questionnaires designed to lay the groundwork for resettlement. Refugees regularly describe their situation in more extempore fashion, sometimes including an autobiography or a curriculum vitae. To read these testimonies is to understand something of the intensity of refugees' experiences and the immediacy of their self-expression. But it's also to question one's privileged position in being allowed to consult this material, which has hitherto been confidential, and to intrude on the lives of individuals, most of whom are no longer alive, but who nevertheless divulged intimate personal details as a condition of being considered as eligible for recognition and assistance. It's impossible not to be stopped in one's tracks by dramatic stories recounted at some length, often in eloquent prose. Take, for example, the letters written by Georgios, a police officer who fled Greece in 1968, having been dismissed from his post by the military junta after 9 years of what he described as faithful service for defending and taking the side of the deposed king. He applied for asylum in Turkey, where the authorities held him in jail in central Anatolia. UNHCR hoped to resettle him in Australia as he wished, and meanwhile urged him to find work locally, something that he resisted, lest he could be regarded as already having been resettled. Yorgos wrote, "Sir, if you were at our place, you should have known what difficulties we are facing here. Justice should be done to us. Nobody hears us. I hope this letter of us will be read and the answer will be given. A good answer which can become a medicine or a bandage which can stop bleeding from our hearts." The story didn't end there. There was a suggestion that Yorgos had killed a Greek port official who acted as an escort when Yorgos boarded a boat on the pretext of visiting an island close to Turkish territorial waters. Had he pushed the official overboard? Yorgos maintained that the man in question had jumped into the sea rather than be pushed, and had jumped into the sea rather than enter Turkish waters, where he drowned. It was a question of his word against that of a Greek boatman who claimed to have witnessed the event. But the disputed version of events scuppered any chance of resettlement in Australia, and UNHCR expressed relief when they managed to persuade the Dutch authorities to admit him. Whether the restoration of democracy in Greece enabled him to return, or for his family to join him in the Netherlands, it's impossible to say. What's clear is the endless uncertainty and how easily a life could unravel. I should sort of make it clear at this point that in reading these case files, it's often impossible to discover where the paper trail ends. It simply comes to an abrupt halt, with no indication of the outcome. And of course, inevitably, Google and Ancestry and sites such as this can sometimes, but often not provide an answer. So UNHCR indeed expended much effort, as did prospective host states and non-governmental organizations, on the resettlement of refugees, what became known as a durable solution. Among the many stories of successful resettlement, the case files disclose instances when refugees of European origin wrote to protest that they had suffered fresh discrimination and exploitation after being resettled. Several letters on file dialed up the rhetoric, describing settled states such as Canada as, quote, a penal colony, a concentration camp. This from a Latvian refugee who had been resettled in 1952, but whose children had been taken into care on grounds of neglect. Having become a Canadian citizen, he was ineligible for UNHCR's assistance, and Geneva could do nothing on his behalf. It was a voluminous, as well as a vitriolic, correspondence that carried on for several years. UNHCR tended to regard such cases as an indication of mental illness or a character defect, but all the same, Anton's final letter ended on a poignant note. Quote, "Even if I'm not a refugee under the 1951 Convention, I am a human being and I live in this world." It shouldn't come as any surprise that this refugee world was marked by fracture and rivalry. Setting to one side internal disagreements such as arose in refugee camps, let me instead mention instances in which refugees insisted that UNHCR neglected them and favoured others. For example, Hungarian-born Claire wrote to UNHCR's leading expert in refugee law, Paul Weiss, in 1965, knowing your authority on the subject. Having reached Geneva in 1957, she demanded to be told why Switzerland refused to recognize as refugees Jews who had been forced to leave Egypt. "You are well aware," she said, "of the situation of Jews in Egypt. You are well aware," the rhetoric again, "of the situation of Jews in Egypt, and I need not go into details of me leaving the country. I might have understood that convention refugees are those relating only to events prior to 1951. This is the so-called temporal clause in the convention. Convention refugees are only those relating to events prior to 1951, were it not for the fact that Hungarians who fled from their country at the same time as the Egyptians do seem to be considered as convention refugees. UNHCR replied that the Refugee Convention required a refugee to demonstrate that the reason for leaving his or her country was as a result of events in Europe prior to 1st of January 1951. And that, quote, "It's for the contracting states to interpret this provision having regard to the circumstances of the case. The only possibility is therefore for you to pursue the matter with the Swiss authorities. We believe, however, it's unlikely they would consider you as falling under the convention." Jackson, the official in question, didn't respond to her correct observation that UNHCR had indeed found ways to circumvent the convention's chronological and geographical limitation. And it seems to me on reflection that letters such as this that point out possible inconsistencies in UNHCR's policy response, in this case in 1965, may have contributed to a shift in overall policy in the refugee regime. Namely, the convention was supplemented by a protocol in 1967, which removed the geographical and chronological limitations. Some refugees not only complained about their treatment, but insisted on teaching UNHCR about their history. And a group of Kurdish refugees who fled Syria in 1970 arrived in Sweden in the hope that we might be accepted as refugees and be granted permits to keep ourselves alive. And they wrote to Geneva in 1970 and sketched a contemporary history of discrimination and persecution. And in so doing, they provided a kind of summary record of persecution, but added, this is only a short account of the detailed genocidal policy of the Syrian government. Like many refugees before and since, they spoke not just of needs, but provided a political analysis. And it worked. The Swedish authorities were pressed by UNHCR to grant them asylum, and they were given permanent residence. But their presence, it seems to me, in UNHCR's archives underscored Sadruddin's point about a refugee world distinguished by the absence of political rights. And the refugee world had other surprises in store. I spoke earlier of Sadruddin's observations about colonial rule. The post-war world was one that UNHCR needed to understand, and fast. National liberation movements posed a particular difficulty for an organization that asserted its non-political stance. Many freedom fighters fled and regrouped in adjacent countries to continue the struggle against colonialism. This included requesting financial support to continue their education in Europe, including in Soviet bloc countries. Should UNHCR regard them as refugees? By the 1970s, the question arose in respect of Portuguese rule in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, as well as the apartheid regime in South Africa. One senior legal officer observed that UNHCR traditionally ruled out providing material assistance to, quote, refugees engaging in political activities directed against their countries of origin. But in his own history lesson, as it were, he referred to the Second World War, arguing for change in policy. Partisans and resistance fighters in other climes and at other times were also freedom fighters against the occupation of their countries by alien forces and powers. Why shouldn't this apply to those engaged in armed struggle in Mozambique, or indeed in Rhodesia or South Africa, whose rulers, quote, by the suppression of the majority indigenous populations, the denial to them of fundamental human rights, earned the opprobrium of the world. And they shouldn't be stigmatized. Indeed, these people in the round might be regarded as heroes, the eternal subject of historical sagas, film epics, and annual official days of remembrance. In other words, if it's good enough for the interpretation and the history of resistance to Nazi rule, why is it a different, as it were, law being applied to freedom fighters in Africa? This didn't immediately sway UNHCR to change its policy or its stance. It was largely an organisation that continued at this time to adhere to a policy of non-interference in a country's internal affairs. But the point I would like to make is that it didn't convince many refugees who wrote to UNHCR on several occasions, such as an Angolan refugee who displayed a nice caustic wit in a letter written from Kinshasa in 1970, in which he said, "If I write to you, it's not for the pure pleasure of putting pen to paper." And many such refugees may have got short shrift, but it's also striking that in the documentation there are plenty of UNHCR officials who say to themselves, well, if you're an intellectual freedom fighter, if you're writing articles, if you're propagating anti-colonial ideas, then maybe that's a different kettle of fish altogether. And this Angolan refugee was a case in point because he was referred to an educational charity. Now, it's clear that the case files of refugees of non-European origin drew upon their knowledge of European history and asserted their rights in relation to international law. Significantly, some of them indeed were less inclined to think of themselves as a fourth world and to argue instead for a place in a reordered world. Some of them indeed, or several of them, articulated a clear internationalist position. One example, a Cameroonian refugee, 30 years of age, Manfred, wrote to Sadruddin from Togo in 1972, saying that he was currently studying for a law degree. He asked for a student bursary. He eventually, for reasons I can't go into at this stage, didn't get it. But he provided graphic detail of persecution. He and his family had been arrested 2 years earlier for having plotted against the government of Cameroon. They received lengthy prison sentences. His father was tortured and killed in Yaoundé in 1971. They were all, as he put it, staunch defenders and supporters of individual liberty and campaigned for the liberation of their country, not only for peace and justice, ideas that are inseparable, but for cultural development. He referenced Giuseppe Mazzini, another exile, as he pointedly said. Have we, he asked, made any progress since Mazzini wrote about liberty in 1835? He referred to the devastation wrought by the 2 world wars and the divided world, and he rounded off by saying, we shouldn't forget, it was precisely those tragic and catastrophic events that led to the creation of international organizations with an ambitious scope greater than anything attempted in the past. Nor should we overlook the way in which the free world came together to condemn the subjugation of the Hungarian people. We must not cease to fight for victory over evil and to ensure that past heroes will not have shed their blood in vain. Another history lesson. In other instances, refugees let their imagination rip and literally envisaged a distinct kind of refugee world. Writing from Rome to Eleanor Roosevelt in March 1955, a 44-year-old Albanian refugee, Mediha, a woman from an elite background, described herself as homeless, rightless, jobless, and without any protection. She suggested, quote, we, millions of refugees, could form nearly an entire state, yet nobody thinks of putting it into action. János S., a Hungarian refugee seaman, took this idea a step further. In a letter to UNHCR in 1953, he, quote, proposed that their sufferances be brought to an end by letting them cooperate in building up a state of their own in the form of a reservation, following the noble example of the USA, where by constitution there was given a place to the Indians under the sun. I have many practical ideas, he said, for solving the question of the refugees. János stressed his credentials. Apart from being a seaman, I am also a journalist. Now, it's easy to dismiss this uncritical view of America's treatment of First Nation people, or to discount this as fantasy, which is ultimately what UNHCR did. But one might alternatively read these statements as illustrative of a willingness to articulate a political stance on behalf of refugees at large. And curiously, the obituary of Chad Varah, the founder of the Samaritans, mentions that in 1920, as a 9-year-old, he advocated the creation of something he called refugia, a homeland for all the world's refugees. Instead, they got the Nansen passport. Intriguingly also, some refugees sought neither the protection of a state nor to create a state of their own, but rather demanded statelessness. Several cases stand out. In one of them, Hans wrote a long letter from Stockholm in 1953 explaining that as a Jew, he'd left Germany in December 1935 on account of the Nazi racial laws that deprived him of nationality. And he settled in Sweden, and now wrote to denounce the corrupt behavior of what he called the centre of neo-Nazism in Stockholm. He didn't wish to seek Swedish naturalization, let alone did he want to be thought of as having German citizenship. On the contrary, having been inspired by the young people he'd met, he didn't seek to acquire any nationality. Rather, he said, the freedom which I seek is that of international mobility. He explained he couldn't accept the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, according to which each person had the right to a nationality. Hans regarded this as the embodiment of outdated values, the values of tradition, the custom of sedentarism, des habitudes de fixation. He was fobbed off with the suggestion that he request travel papers from the Swedish authorities, which rather missed the point that he was making. It's important to stress that the world of refugees announced itself to Geneva irrespective of whether or not they qualified for UNHCR's assistance. Take, for example, Marika, a young Palestinian refugee who contacted UNHCR in 1970 from an address in California. Although there were some exceptions, Palestinian refugees who were outside the aegis of UNRWA, the UN Agency for Refugees, UNHCR did consider these sorts of cases. And Marika wrote, "My major is social psychology. I will graduate with a BA degree in June. My parents are in the occupied West Bank of Jordan, in Bethlehem. They are unable to help me in my education. I am very interested in teaching and doing research in the Middle East, as I know we lack a great deal of it. By teaching and doing research, I hope to understand the world. I hope to help the world understand the Arab world, and the Arab world understand the West." And Geneva referred her to an educational charity. Again, it's tantalizing that she too disappears from view. But her presence in the case files confirms that refugees such as Marika look to the future as much as to the past. So the case files open a window on refugees from different parts of the world and from different times, and provide an opportunity to hear how refugees express themselves, often at times of considerable ordeal. This might be because they were victims of armed conflict or exposed to persecution by virtue of being a minority in a newly formed state. It might be because they'd reached advanced age, although UNHCR tends to regard advanced age as people over 50, and wanted to live out the rest of their lives in relative comfort. Sometimes they wrote to Geneva in an inventive fashion, as did this person, Ahmed T. Now, there are very few photographs in these case files, except for passport-type photographs attached to a resettlement form. But here you have, I think, a very striking example of someone who wanted to get treatment for his tuberculosis. He was writing from Casablanca in 1960, and I've come across nothing quite as wonderful and as inventive as this. Adding, I think, for dramatic effect in the hope that it would fall into the hands of someone who would not discard it. And he was indeed referred to health care. Anyway, Refugees like Ahmed, like Barika and others who figure in the case files did so because their letters and other documents were retained for a legal and bureaucratic purpose. This supports the view that the refugee world was something to be managed. Refugees were a movable object to be shunted in and between other worlds, subject to the stipulations and vagaries of various states. Yet on closer inspection, it's clear that the men and women who wrote to Geneva articulated their own perspectives and aspirations as they confronted the situations in which they found themselves. As we've seen, some refugees contemplated how the world at large might be improved or transformed. And to repeat, refugees came from all corners of the world. Exclusion from the international refugee regime as understood in Geneva did not deter them. So returning to Sadruddin, can we speak of a fourth world? Yes, in the sense that refugees constituted an anomaly in a world where everyone is supposed to belong to a state. Yes, in the sense that refugees who qualified for recognition can claim protection under international law. Yes, also, insofar as refugees are often confined to camps and thereby physically set aside from other human beings. To these considerations, it's important to add that some refugees viewed the label not as a stigma, but as a rallying cry in support of their demands for restitution and return. It was a matter of pride to belong to the refugee world, to experience not just its constraints and the possibility, but its possibilities for collective mobilization in defense of their rights. This observation applies to many Russian refugees in interwar Europe. It's certainly true of Spanish Republican refugees, and it remains a defining aspect of Palestinian displacement. At the same time, we need to exercise caution. The refugee world did not exist in isolation. It's essential to take full account of the encounters between refugees and non-refugees, including those who wielded power over them. This is why in my own work I've deployed the term refugeedom, a translation from Russian usage during the First World War, to encapsulate not just the mainsprings of displacement, but also how refugees negotiated the categorization at the hands of those who saw it as their job to manage and assist them. Think of this, if you will, as a web spun by governments, intergovernmental and non-governmental actors, and by refugees themselves. For this reason, I find it difficult to think of refugee history as something to be written from either a top-down or a bottom-up perspective. What matters is to pay close attention to the dynamic interaction between multiple actors. Robert Key referred to the humdrum particulars of refugees who made the best of their situation. Yet humdrum, with its implications of a narrowed outlook, captures only a fraction of the refugee world. Close inspection of the UNHCR case files and what refugees had to say makes it possible to part the curtain on what the Nobel Prize-winning novelist Annie Ernaux called the vast anonymity of a distant generation. To begin to understand what refugees thought of the world around them, not just what the world thought of them. It was, to be sure, a fractured world, a world on the move, not only in the obvious sense that the world of 1918 or 1939 was not the same as the world of 1956 or 1989, let alone 2025, but because the institutional framework was not cast in stone, and crucially, because refugees did not present in a singular or uniform manner. So what did the refugee world look like after 1975? To fully grasp how UNHCR confronted the issues raised by refugees, we must await the release of new material, and this is some way off, and will require resources that at present seem unlikely to be forthcoming. We know something of policy making in the broader refugee regime at the turn of the millennium. Less emphasis on resettlement, more on containment and repatriation in line with Western countries' intransigence, and a declining respect for international refugee law. And this is reflected in the high bar that governments set for recognition of asylum seekers' claims to refugee status and issues around returning them to what are deemed safe countries. But we shouldn't at the same time exaggerate the shift in policy, given that by the third quarter of the 20th century, refugees from the global south were already discouraged from seeking to resettle in the global north. Nor, in my view, should we assume that the world has changed because of a rise in the total number of refugees. In absolute terms, perhaps, but not relatively when set aside alongside the growth in global population. Overstating the size or escalation of the refugee population now plays into the hands of governments seeking to diminish refugees' rights without addressing the underlying causes of mass displacement or doing much to improve the prospects of refugees or to hear what they have to say. So the refugee world is unlikely to be dismantled, but it can be understood historically and politically. Thinking about refugees in the past lends itself to all kinds of disciplinary approaches and endeavors: political science, law, anthropology, sociology, economics, as well as to different subdisciplines in history, including the study of the history of war, diplomacy, state formation and collapse, as well as gender studies, the study of emotional regimes and practices, and oral history. There are questions to be posed about broader issues of historical method, about sources, who gets to write refugee history, how to interpret material generated by different actors and for different purposes, including gaps and silences. The novelist Joseph Roth once said that it's the things that you are not told that arouse your interest. How to relate the realm of the intimate with the expectations of those in authority. How to respond ethically to the testimony of those who occupy a marginal position in society. How to reflect upon our own positionality as historians, and not least, how to communicate issues of recurrent concern to a wider audience whose appetite for history can surely accommodate an informed discussion of the refugee world. Thank you.